Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, March 3rd, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for having me back in your show. Thank you, and hello to everybody.
Yeah. Let's get started with the meeting between Donald Trump and Zelensky and the way that everybody's talking about this meeting and how what happened at that meeting and the way that Donald Trump was treating Zelensky was just putting out some sort of facts that nobody was able to talk about in the mainstream media or even in the White House. Here is a part of what has happened in in the White House.
Trouble.
Can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No,
Can
you've
I
done a lot
answer?
of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not
I
winning.
know.
You're not winning this. You have a damn
We-
good chance of
we are
coming out
staying,
okay because of
Mr.
us.
President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
You haven't
in
been
this
alone.
cabinet,
You
and
haven't
not
been
only
alone.
in this
We
cabinet.
gave you, through
I
this
said thank
stupid
you.
president, $350 billion.
You
we
voted
gave
for
you
your
military
president.
equipment,
You
and you
voted
men
for
are
your
brave,
president.
but they had to use our military.
What about West?
If you didn't have
You
our
invited
military
me-
equipment,
you invited
if
me
you
to
didn't
speak-
have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3
okay?
days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days, this is something
Maybe
new.
less.
In 2 weeks, of course, yes.
It's going to be a very hard thing to do business like this. I
Again,
tell you.
just say thank you.
I said a lot of
accept
times
that there,
thank you
accept
to
that,
American people.
accept that there are disagreements, and let's go litigate those disagreements rather than trying to fight it out in the American media when you're wrong. We know that you're wrong.
But you see, I think it's good for the American people to see what's going on.
I understand, sir.
I think it's
I
very
understand.
important. That's why I kept this going so long.
Yeah, here is what happened. And right after this meeting, that we've learned from Fox News that Zelensky was kicked out of the White House after this meeting. And here is what Donald Trump posted after that. He said that Zelensky can come back when he's ready for peace. What does it mean in the mind of Zelensky? He says that we want Ukraine needs just and lasting peace. And when you look at the situation, the way that they were discussing with Zelensky, when the media is there, the press is there, just reporting on that, it seems to me that Donald Trump had two strategies. One of them is to say the truth, the ugly truth about the war in Ukraine, and the second one was to just change the rhetoric in the mainstream media, because mainstream is full of some sort of propaganda when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine. He has two main objectives in this meeting. How did you find it, Colin?
Well, first of all, if we come back to the meeting itself, we have to acknowledge that the meeting was, in fact, something like 50 minutes long. And what the international media have focused on are only the last 10 minutes or so. And during the 41st minutes, everything went perfectly well. And it starts to derail as Zelensky started to ask a very aggressive question to J.D. Vance. In fact, that's how it happened, because J.D. Vance started to talk about the importance of diplomacy, which I think was absolutely right at this point. But Zelensky then asked a very, very aggressive question, and the whole thing derailed and come exactly what you have shown. Now, the problem here, and in fact, what you have suggested or shown afterwards with the tweet of Zelensky and so on, shows exactly the nature of the problem here. We have Zelensky, which is widely supported by the Europeans, who doesn't want to have a political solution to the conflict. He still dreams, I can say dream because there is no factual aspect of that, he still dreams of a military victory. He wants to to have the conquested territories back, and all that, and the Russian back to the borders of 1991. And this is not going to happen. On the other hand, you have another view, which is the Trump view, which says, okay, at this point, we see that there will be no, if there is a military solution, it will be worse for Ukraine. Regardless of how we understand the losses of Russia, you can take the problem for any angle. If we continue the conflict, it will be worse for Ukraine. So the best solution is to stop it and to let enter the diplomats into the game. And that's the whole point. And that's exactly where you had the break between Zelensky and J.D. Vance. And we have to understand that the Americans, and Trump in particular, I mean, I should say Trump rather than the Americans, because there is the history is so that you have a new presidency, you have a new president in the United States. And this president has, of course, right or wrong, its own views on the importance of the conflict, the importance to this conflict related to the national interest of the United States, and the importance of this conflict in the wider global, let's say, situation. If you talk about the situation in Europe and the situation related to his own objectives related to China. And therefore, he can afford, as a new president, to say, well, this Ukrainian war was the war of my predecessor. And I want to that was a wrong policy, and I want to get rid of this policy. And I want to change the focus and have the focus on my own, or what I consider as the US national interests. And what was the interest of Biden? That was the interest of Biden, but it's not mine. So it's not a pacifist view. It's not even a view, as you see more and more in the Western, especially European media, that Trump has adopted the rhetoric of Putin or things like this. It's nothing like that. It's just that he can afford to get rid of the policy of his predecessor. And it's a totally pragmatic approach. And we know that Biden had kind of a, let's say, personal understanding of this conflict, and even a personal relationship to this conflict. I'm not even mentioning the role of his son in the Burisma affair and all that. I mean, we don't go into those details, but you could, and even Antony Blinken. Remember, Antony Blinken has his family originating from Ukraine. Victoria Nuland, who also was an actor, especially in 2014, but also later in the Blinken administration, and Victoria Nuland was also originating from this country, from Ukraine originally. His grandfather was from. So there were somehow a lot of personal issue related to the conflict in Ukraine. And that's probably affected in some way their approach to the conflict, their relationship, in not just the relationship towards Russia, but also the way to address the conflict. It's fascinating to see that this conflict has been addressed without any diplomacy at all. In fact, the name of the game was to cut Russia completely from the Western world. and probably for the whole world, actually. So it was about cutting diplomatic ties, economic ties, political ties, everything. And, and therefore, diplomacy had no space for that. Now, Trump has a completely different view on that. He can afford to change the angle of vision, the angle of approach, and he says, well, we have to give an opportunity to diplomacy. And here it's also important because when you read the or you look at the European media, you have the feeling that Trump is negotiating peace with Russia at the expense of Ukraine, which is not the case. I mean, what you had a couple of meetings in Riyadh and then in Turkey between the Russians and the Americans. Now, the purpose of these meetings were not the peace in Ukraine, but were to establish a framework to talk, a dialogue framework, I could say, between USA and Russia. This was the topic of these meetings. And in that framework, then that opens the door for further discussion about the situation in Ukraine. And then that will be where the Ukrainians and Ukrainian diplomacy, if it does exist, if this diplomacy could enter the scene and talk to Russia. But the first step, because every ties had been cut by the Biden administration. So the first step, which is the step we have witnessed in the last couple of weeks, is to reestablish the ties, to reestablish a framework. And that, in my view, regardless of how we feel about the Ukrainian conflict, this is something that should have happened well before. Because even when you had conflict, even during World War II, in fact, you had a diplomacy. It was probably less active, but it was there. You know, during the Vietnam War, during the Cold War, we had these diplomatic ties. And these diplomatic ties allowed to have negotiation on the limitation of nuclear weapons, on non-nuclear forces, and so on and so forth. Conventional forces in Europe and so on. Because even if we were at war to some extent, between quotation marks, we kept those relations, those diplomatic ties. And now we have to re-establish that. So I think that's absolutely legitimate and makes a lot of sense from a great nation to have relationship with other nations. I mean, you remember what Marco Rubio said to CBS a couple of weeks ago? He said, well, US has national interest, Russia has national interest, and China have national interests, and all of them will follow their national interests. So when you accept that, and when you accept that the others have also their view on their own national interest, that means that you need to have an interface to talk with them. Because at one point, you may come to the point where you're at war, trade war, or you can find different ways of waging war. But you need to have an interface to connect, to discuss, to talk about the issues. So that's what Trump is doing. And of course, this is something that surprised the international community. And when I say international community, I'm looking at it from a European point of view. And in Europe, well, of course, you have to understand that in Europe, regardless of what policy Trump is applying, Trump is not very much loved in Europe. He's considered as the one who doesn't want immigration, wants to deport immigrants and things like this. And that's the way people understand Trump. And a lot of perception that Europeans had during the first mandate of Trump are coming back to the surface today. So Trump is not, from a European point of view, a welcome president. On the other hand, we can argue about whether Trump's policies are good or bad. The fact of the matter is that he was elected by the American people, and the American people somehow wanted these policies. That's democracy, and that relates very much to what J.D. Vance said in Munich a couple of weeks ago, when he said the main problem that Europe is facing today is the lack of freedom of expression and all the liberties who are vanishing in Europe, because there is a sense that you can be accepted by the European community only if you have the same mindset as the European community. The world is diverse. There are diverse cultures, there are different approach, different understanding of problems. They are cultural, they are political, they are related to the situation, they are situational. But the reality is that there are different point of views. And what the Europeans have not understood is that other areas, other countries, other cultures have their own perception of realities. And that's part of the diversity. So this is very strange. In the last couple of years, you could see in Europe the denial of diversity to some extent. Oh yes, we agree. What we call diversity is LGBT and all that, but it's not a different culture. You're not allowed to have different views. You're allowed to be transgender, but you're not allowed to have a different view on issues such as environment, such as climate change, such as the Russia, China, Muslim world, Iran. So here you are not allowed to have a diverse view. So this is a diversity. In Europe, diversity is understood as something very superficial, but not as an engine to promote intellectual diversity, intellectual exchanges, and in fact, enrichment, because the diverse cultures is what promotes the enrichment of the culture, enrichment of the intellect, enrichment of our understanding of the world. And I think we have to cope, even if we don't like them. But that's a reality. Those people have equal rights to think as we do. So this is exactly the point. And that's where we are. So that's, in fact, what we have seen in the Oval Office Friday is, in fact, the confrontation, or I would say the collision between two understanding of the conflict. The one from Zelensky, which is delusional, which is without any strategy, because we don't know exactly what he wants to achieve. Who does it want to achieve? We understand from a Ukrainian point of view that you want to recover the territories that have been lost, that you want to retrieve what you had in 1991 or something. I can understand that. But at the same time, if you have the leader, it's not enough to want that. But he should say, how does he want to achieve that? What does he consider as a victory? What does he define a success in this war? And we know that when we go from a factual point of view, and that's the other view brought by the Trump team, that's a reality. It's simply the reality. How do you want to achieve that? And that's exactly what Donald Trump said to Zelensky when he said, "You have no cards." And that's the reality. Zelensky has no cards, and that's precisely the reason why he is in the Oval Office, to have some cards, because he has none. So he is on the demanding side, and we are on the demanding side. It's difficult to impose the people who are giving you what you would like to have, to impose a vision. And that's exactly where you have this confrontation. You have a pragmatic understanding of the problem from the Trump administration based on fact. It's not about being nice to Putin or everywhere or everybody or anybody. It is just the purpose of coping with what is on the ground. You have a situation, you have to cope with that situation, period. And since you don't have any alternative to reverse the situation, to make it better in some way, then it's probably better to stop where it is before it becomes worse. So that's the Trump administration. And that's on Zelensky, and what we have seen later in London, and of course the reaction by Emmanuel Macron and all that, is a kind of delusional approach to the conflict. Because again, the Europeans have been caught on the back foot on that. They have not prepared anything. Although they knew since November at least, probably they could have prepared an alternative scenario before. But at least since November, they know that Trump will be president. And Trump has expressed already what he wants to do with the conflict. But still, none of these European leaders, none of them, not at national level and not even at European Union level, they have developed some kind of plan or strategy to address the Trump reaction or the Trump approach to the problem. And now they are on the back foot. And that's exactly what we have seen. First, with these meetings organized in emergency by Emmanuel Macron in Paris with just a couple of countries. And then you have this meeting in London, also with a couple of countries, not all European countries, by the way, because you have only 15 countries, and leaving aside the Baltic states, for instance, because they don't have any assets and military assets to engage in Ukraine. Probably, I don't know exactly the reason, but fact of the matter is they were not here, and it's not even the European Union, because UK is not part of the European Union. So, and in the European Union, you have, for instance, Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, who wrote an open letter saying that Slovakia will not be part of any operation against Russia and in Ukraine. So, and we know that Orban will probably have a similar position. So we see that Europeans have been caught on the back foot. They are divided. They don't have a common approach to the problem. And even the 15 countries who were in London have apparently no strategy either. We are back to the proposal that were made 1 year ago by Emmanuel Macron to deploy some troops in Ukraine. And we know that, point one, Europeans don't have enough troops to deploy a contingent that might reverse the situation in Ukraine. That's point one. And point two is that if things go wrong, they would need the backstopping of the US. And the US is not willing to do so, because the US, as I've said many times, and that's a constant policy since the 50s. The US doesn't want or don't want to confront directly Soviet Union at the time and Russia today. I mean, the thing is that these are two nuclear superpower. There is no way that they want to confront themselves directly in a conflict that may evolve into a nuclear confrontation. And that's the Americans have always been very clear. So I still don't understand why the Europeans are still asking the US to provide some backstopping. And even NATO is not involved in that. But first of all, because NATO is, in fact, somehow you can interpret that as you want, but it's an arm of the US in the sense that NATO, as Jens Stoltenberg has repeatedly said, the NATO is a nuclear power. I mean, the purpose of NATO was to bring the Europeans under the US nuclear umbrella. So if you have any NATO involvement in the conflict, that may lead to nuclear confrontation. That's why NATO is out of the equation. So here again, the Europeans are totally delusional with that because they still try to press the US to have an involvement in this conflict to some extent, even if it's in a kind of backstopping type of involvement. And the US will not accept that because the risk is too big. So we are in a very strange situation because what I have seen many comments and reports in Europe related to the meeting in London, but in no report and no commentator comes with an alternative to the old proposals that, I mean, this proposal of sending troops on in Ukraine. So there's a lack of imagination from the Europeans. They don't even mention the use of diplomacy in that. There is no way they want to talk to Russia. And of course, this approach of the Europeans, when you look at what the commentators, both journalists and politicians, say, and even I remember the Swiss ambassador to Kiev was my friend Claude Wild. He was ambassador there up to last year. And he said on the Swiss TV, when he was interviewed, he said, we cannot accept any agreement with Russia because accepting an agreement with Russia is in fact rewarding the aggressor. Which is, I was astonished by this kind of explanation because that's precisely the purpose of diplomacy, to solve situations. I mean, he acted as the guy, the judge, in fact, is making a judgment. No, these guys are bad, so we don't talk to them. But it's not the role of diplomacy. The role of diplomacy is precisely try to re-establish ways of communication. In German, the word Botschafter, that comes from the word Botschaft. By the way, in French, ambassade, which is from where the word embassy comes from, ambassade comes from, ambassadeur, these words initially define a message. Eine Botschaft is a message. Ein Botschafter, an ambassador, is etymologically speaking, is a messenger. Meaning that the role of the embassies, the role of the diplomats is to exchange message, to establish a communication line, even when the political situation becomes extremely tense and where you don't have, let's say, possibility to connect otherwise. The diplomacy is the last string of connection that you have. But surprisingly enough, in Europe, we tend even to cut that string. And that's where we are beyond the conventional understanding of diplomacy. I mean, the Americans talk to the Taliban. The Americans used to talk to the North Vietnamese. We, at one point, we had to talk to the Germans during World War One, during World War Two. So, or after, we had to talk to them. Even during the Cold War, you had diplomatic relations. And this is even the Israeli, with some contortions, but they still speak to the Hamas, to the Iranians, because there is a diplomacy. I mean, these are very tenuous strings, but they are. And they may need some intermediaries and things like this, and that's perfectly. I mean, the Switzerland has been the connection between Cuba and the United States before 2018, when 16, I think, when the relationship were reestablished by Obama between US and Cuba. But since the 50s, Switzerland used to make the link between the two. So the relationship was not totally cut. Same with Iran. Switzerland, the Swiss embassy was the link between the US and the Iranian government. So even if you didn't have a diplomatic relationship formally, you still had a channel of communication through the Swiss embassy. So this is, you need this link in order to solve problem, because regardless of what you feel and how you think about Vladimir Putin, whether it's good or bad, I don't know. But sure enough, there is a point where this conflict will be over. You will have to reestablish some relations. And we see today that we are slowly reaching the point where if we don't have any dialogue with Russia, Ukraine will simply disappear. This is the reality. So I think the Trump administration, regardless of what we think of Trump and all that, and regardless even of the objectives they have, because as I said many times, I'm not sure that the Trump administration is a pacifist administration. I don't think so. I'm just consider they are pragmatic. And they consider that investing in a conflict that leads nowhere is just a black hole where you just pour billions of dollars without knowing where they go. And which is, by the way, a reality, because I just saw a report that was mentioning that almost 300,000 weapons have simply disappeared from Ukraine. So meaning that all these weapons, that's just taxpayers' money to some extent, that has just disappeared. So who wants to finance or put, let's say, taxpayers' money into a black hole? Doesn't make any sense. So I think it's a pragmatic approach. And given the situation, if the situation were reverse, that means if Ukraine was in a position of strength, and if Ukraine had operational successes, then the situation would be completely different, because, of course, people would accept more easily that a defeat from Russia and all that. But today we are in a situation where if you don't have a dialogue, what looms is a total defeat of Ukraine. So there is not much room for decision, in fact. And that's exactly what Trump was saying by mentioning the fact that Zelensky has no cards anymore. And the Europeans, they are keen to.
Colonel, the point that you've raised right now about the cards, it's so important because right after that, Zelensky responded that this is a war, it's not just playing cards. It shows that how there is a huge misunderstanding on his part. He doesn't understand what Donald Trump is talking about. Donald Trump is talking about the long-term strategy. How long do you want to continue this conflict when you're losing?
Well, I think obviously Trump used the image of a card to explain that there are not so much opportunities anymore for Ukraine, and Zelensky played with those words, kind to mock Trump, which I think is not very appropriate in his situation, because the fact of the matter is that Ukraine is losing its cards every day. The military cards. Remember that in May, that was early June 2022, Zelensky said, from this point on, we are depending on the West for our equipment. Meaning that in June 2022, the Ukrainian army, as we knew it in March or February, was simply destroyed. And later in November, early December 2022, when Zaluzhny asked for new equipment, then he started to ask for tanks such as Abrams tank and Leopard 2 tanks and all that, because the equipment that was delivered after June 2022 had been destroyed again. So you can, in fact, to some extent, you could say that the Russians have destroyed the Ukrainian army 2 or 3 times since February 2022. And that's the reason why the military support provided by the West, and mainly by the US, was so important, because all these cards have been lost already. And today, the West understands, and the Americans at first, they understand that they don't have the capacities to sustain such a rhythm of losses in Ukraine with the equipment, because the industrial base, the military industrial base, is not tailored for such a type of war. We can deplore this, we can criticize that, but that's simply the reality. And that was explained by a report published last year by the European Command, US European Command, that said that basically the production of missiles and ammunition by Russia is 3 times what the whole of NATO is producing in 1 year. So meaning that there are physical limitations beyond the policy of Trump, meaning that the cards that were mentioned by Trump are real cards. They are missing. And what Zelensky doesn't understand, or doesn't want to understand, is that the West has also its limitations. And by the way, when we talked about deploying troops in Ukraine, some experts have said that in order to reverse the situation in Ukraine, we should probably have something like 200,000 NATO troops in Ukraine. But what the British and the French have managed to announce is 30,000. So we are not even close to the number that would reverse. So, meaning that uh, there is a huge amount of delusion in Zelensky in Zelensky talking. He doesn't realize that the West cannot help anymore, and the Europeans play a perverse role here because they keep maintaining the illusion that they can support Ukraine. But again, for what? For what purpose? For which objective? Nobody has defined any objective. And of course, when you talk, oh, to recover the territory that was lost and all that. But how? How can you achieve that? And that's where I think there is a kind of fundamental dishonesty by the Europeans, because instead of acknowledging that even if they mobilize all the resource they have, they will not be able to reverse the course of the conflict in Ukraine. Instead of doing that, they keep that illusion that they can help Zelensky. And there is something that the Europeans don't even address, but this is the reconstruction of Ukraine. Because who will pay for that? My feeling is that the Europeans still dream on using those frozen assets, the Russian frozen assets, to fund that. But if they do so, remember that these assets were, in fact, if I can put it very simply, this is money that the Russians have provided to they were in fact loans to the Europeans, and the Europeans now don't want to reimburse the loan. So in fact, this is stolen money. But as you can see, the economies of Europeans today will require new loans. They will need to have money to reconstruct their economy. That's very true in Germany. It's very true in France, and probably in other countries, because the economy has suffered so much. So they will need money. Who will have the trust or enough trust in Europeans to provide money to those governments if there is the risk that they can just freeze and steal that money? This is all the question of trust which is addressed here. And so there is a kind of perversity in that, because we know, the Europeans know that they are destroying the Ukraine. They don't have any plan to rebuild Ukraine. They don't have any plan to achieve some kind of objective. We don't know even what kind of objective they want to achieve. This is just war. At least Trump has the advantage of saying, my objective is peace, is to have the guns silent in Ukraine, which is an objective. Whether it's a good one, a bad one, you can argue on that, but at least an objective. Europeans have none. And they say they want to achieve peace, but we know that peace will not be achieved by just providing additional ammunition. You're just repeating what you have done in the last 3 years. So there's a fundamental flaw in the European thinking on that, I think, and that's totally separate from what you may think about Russia and Putin and all that. It's just the pure observation of what is going on the field. And that's exactly what I think the J.D. Vance was saying, that said, in fact, we are not making, or Rubio was saying that, we are not making any concession to the Russians. We are just making observation of what's happening on the ground. Period. It's just the mere observation of that that makes us decide this. It's not any concession. There is no concession in that. The reality is that Russia is winning. You can take the problem from any direction. You can even take the one of Mark Rutte, who said that Ukraine must win, but currently the front line is moving in the wrong direction. But it's another way of acknowledging the mere fact that Russians are simply winning. And this is very interesting. By the way, I can resist to show you that picture because it's so funny. That was a picture just before going to Washington. Emmanuel Macron made a kind of a tweet, and he put this video on the on the net, and you see that the map of Ukraine is reversed, because in fact he didn't notice that he had his image mirrored in the on the screen. So he presented this video, and with the Ukrainian map upside down. But very interesting in this video, what did he say? He said, I will tell Trump that it's not him to be weak against Putin. I will tell him, it's not you, Trump. You are a big guy. You are strong. You cannot do what Putin wants. It's not you. It's very interesting. I mean, if you see that video, it's funny, and it was marked on the networks on that. But he didn't get something, and that's something I said before at the very beginning of our program today, is that it's not Trump's war. So he doesn't. A lot of people have argued that it will be a defeat for the US and all that. No, it's not a defeat for the US. That's a defeat of the Biden administration, because the current administration has never adopted this war. It's not Trump's war. It's Biden's war. And if it fails, it's because Biden was not able to manage the conflict. And that's a reality, by the way. So Trump and the Trump team doesn't consider that as a defeat of theirs. It's a defeat of the previous administration. And therefore, and what was interesting in this comment of Emmanuel Macron, as I said, that was just before he went to Washington last week, is that he hasn't got that. And that leads to a question, and that's a question that it's not just related to that, but to the whole management of the conflict by the European leaders, is how are these leaders informed about the conflict? And I think here, I'm putting my previous hat as a member of the strategic intelligence. Strategic intelligence has as a function to provide intelligence to the government. I mean, the client is the government, not other parties. So we know how important it is to provide the decision makers at government strategic level and government level, to provide them with the right picture of the situation, not the picture that suits the media, that suits the common wisdom and all that. No, this is a picture that reflects the reality, even if it's a harsh reality. But here you have, I mean, I had the feeling when I was looking at Emmanuel Macron that he had his own perception of the conflict. that nobody told him, explained him that this conflict is not Trump's conflict. And that would change very much the approach to the way he addressed the question with Donald Trump. And I think this whole conflict, since it started, probably even since 2014, is totally misunderstood in the West, and in particular in Europe, because it's dominated by a narrative or interpretation of the conflict, not the conflict as it is, but the conflict as we understand it. And that's exactly why we are in this situation today. And coming back to your your first question about this confrontation in the Oval Office, this is where where the reality collides with the narrative. We're exactly at this point. So I understand that Zelensky has his own view on that. He's part of the conflict. I mean, I have a lot of understanding for Zelensky because he's part of the conflict. So to me, to some extent, I understand that he has a biased understanding of the conflict. What strikes me is that those who are external to the conflict, European Union and all that those people, those elites, those decision makers have exactly the same bias as Zelensky. That's not possible. There is a dysfunction here, a fundamental dysfunction. They should have the approach of like the one in a football field. I don't know, the guy in black who the word is missing.
Referee.
The referee, exactly. We should have the view of the referee, not the view of the players. And this view of the referee means that he has the whole battlefield in the same vision, and he has to understand the whereabouts of each party to the conflict and be able to make decisions based on by balancing the interests of both, not just siding with one. I mean, if you had a referee that sides with one team, you would say that something is wrong. And again, Zelensky is, I would say, the captain of one team. Therefore, he has a biased understanding, and that's normal. But it's not normal from those who are outside of the conflict. And I think that's where you see the dysfunction when you hear Keir Starmer or even Emmanuel Macron, when he was back from Washington, he said, well, we cannot allow Russia to threaten Europe. But when did Russia threaten Europe? We know exactly the reason why he is saying that is that because the European perception of the conflict is that Putin is trying to rebuild the former Soviet Union. Putin is neither communist nor an aficionado of the former Soviet Union, and he never threatened the Europe of rebuilding the Soviet Union. This is the origin and the reason for entering Ukraine. I'm saying for entering Ukraine. It doesn't mean that it's not, there are other roots of the problem, but the reason why Russia entered Ukraine is the threat towards the Russian population of the Donbass. That's the reason for Russia to come into Ukraine. NATO and the extension of NATO and all that is a concern of the Russians, has always been, but this is not the reason why the Russians entered Ukraine. And failing to understand that leads, of course, to the situation that then Russia threatens Europe. But what, even if, and that's where you see that the narrative has also its own contradiction. I mean, France has never belonged to the Soviet Union. You know, admitting, even if we admit that Putin was to rebuild Soviet Union, Poland has never been part of the Soviet Union. Hungary, Slovakia, they have never been part of the Soviet Union. So we see that the limitation of the narrative, even the narrative had its own limitations. And then Emmanuel Macron mentioned how he has nuclear weapons and he has threatened to use them. And here again, it's a lie, simply a lie, because Russians have never threatened to use nuclear weapons. They have systematically, and in 100% of the case, they have responded to a European threat to use nuclear weapons. And the first one was Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French defense minister, on the 24th of February 2022, so the day of the start of the military operation, the Russian military operation, when Le Drian said Putin should be aware that NATO is a nuclear power. And then Vladimir Putin said, well, we have nuclear weapons as well. Then you had also a very significant threat provided by Liz Truss, that we mentioned before, as she was candidate for the position of prime minister. In an interview given to the British TV, the journalist asked her if she was ready to use the nuclear weapon against Russia. And she said yes. And the journalist said, even if it threatens to trigger global destruction? And she said, yes, even if it threatens to create a global destruction. And then, of course, then you had Vladimir Putin coming also with the issue of being careful because Russia has also. So it was always, every time Vladimir Putin has mentioned nuclear weapons, it was as a response of some inconsiderate declaration from Western leaders. So we have created a picture of a Russia that want to expand, that want to recreate, and nobody knows exactly whether it's the Tsarist empire or the Soviet Union, and we don't know exactly what he wants, but he wants, you know. It's based on nothing because the Russians have never declared that. There is absolutely no single doctrine document that mentions that. There is no strategy. On the contrary, remember that Russia asked to be part of NATO. It entered the Partnership for Peace in the mid-90s. The Partnership for Peace, which is an extension of NATO, of which also Switzerland was part, Austria, Belarus, and all that. Now I think Belarus and Russia have been expelled from that. But Switzerland, for instance, was a part of this Partnership for Peace program. And that's by the way, I was 5 years in NATO. I was 5 years in NATO under this program, I mean, offered by the Partnership for Peace. Russia was exactly had the same willingness to join the Western community as other countries such as Sweden, Switzerland, and others. So how come do we come to this idea that Russia wants to expand and recreate Soviet Union In addition to that, it's factually and even doctrinally wrong. I mean, the Russia today has a capitalist system, as you have in Europe, in Switzerland, and in others. Whether the democracy is perfect or not, we can argue of that. But I come from Switzerland. When I look at France, I'm not sure that France has a perfect democratic system. As Swiss, I can say that because the population is voting for everything, not just to elect people, but also we made decision. We decide on the taxes. We decide on the expenses. We decide whether or not we'll buy a new fighter for the armed forces. That's the people who decide that. To build a highway, to build a tunnel through the Alps, that's the people who decide this, because it involves people's money, taxpayers' money. So that's my understanding of democracy. But in France, they decide on nothing. They just elect the president, and more or less that's it. So for me, it's just a monarchy where you elect the king. It's only that. It doesn't go beyond this. And so how do you call France? Do you call that a democracy? When you see the UK, for instance, the freedom of expression in UK, I mean, you can be jailed for any kind of position you have towards Palestine and all that. Is that freedom of expression? Probably not. Not in my view. But again, I have the view of a Swiss. Although Switzerland is also losing its freedom of expression when it comes to Palestine, by the way. But but so what are we calling democracy today? And democracy is disappearing in the West. It's fading away. Or the what we call democracy today is not the democracy I knew when I was kid. Even in Switzerland. Even in Switzerland, it's more democratic than France. But still, it has changed. It's not the same. So we have that. So we can criticize Russia, but I'm not sure that we are in a position to criticize Russia if on our side, in our countries, we are just destroying the freedom of expression, freedom of press, freedom of everything, basically. Again, today, Russia today is banned in Europe, basically, as an example. But during the Cold War, you could buy the Pravda in the papers outlets. You could buy the Pravda, Literaturnaya Gazeta. You found it and I think even in Bern you couldn't find Krasnaya Zvezda. I'm not sure, but I think it was even that, which was the paper of the Ministry of Defense of Soviet Union at the time. So we had basically more freedom 50 years ago than we have today. Today we ban everything. So if someone thinks not exactly as you wish, then you ban him. You ban him on the social networks. You ban him. You even jail him. That's just something that never happened during the Cold War. So we can criticize probably Russia. I'm not living in Russia. I'm not able to judge. Maybe it's justified. Maybe not. But what is sure is that in our country, this has degraded. Massively degraded. So based on that, I think our understanding of the conflict in Ukraine is extremely biased. And whether for every country, for every conflict, you have people who are more for this one or for the other party. This is, I can understand to some extent that you can be favorable to one party or the other. What I don't understand is that decision makers can make decisions with such a bias to the point of cutting any relationship with the Russians, as an example. That's where things go wrong, in my view. And this is, I think that's what the whole crisis with Zelensky is revealing. This is this absence of um, openness to understand that we have now a conflict. We need to solve the conflict, not to see how to prolong it, not to find solution. I mean, illusory solutions. We have to find real solutions, and if we don't do so, the Ukraine will disappear. And this is what the Russian intelligence, the external intelligence, foreign intelligence service, said a few months ago. He said, "Well, if everything continued that way, we might see or witness the desperation of Ukraine." And the Foreign Intelligence Service, by the way, and it's interesting to mention that because a few weeks ago, and that was early February, I think, there was a report by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service who said NATO wants to get rid of Zelensky. And of course, it was seen in the West as Russian disinformation, propaganda, and try to influence and blah, 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 blah. And today, what do you see in the media in the West saying that people questioning the presence of Zelensky or the authority or the legitimacy of Zelensky? And you have more and more people suggesting that probably it should be a good idea to change him and to have other people. And again, I don't know. I mean, we talk about Zaluzhny and all that. I don't know if it's a good choice. I have no idea on that. But the fact of the matter is that what the Russians were saying just 1 month ago was in fact perfectly right. And we dismissed that because, of course, the Russians can only lie, but they were right. And that explains that, in fact, it would be worth talking and listening more to the Russians. And whether we agree with them or not, this is not the question. The question is that if we don't do anything, we will not improve things. You don't improve things if you just remain seated. That's I think that's the lesson of this whole episode of Trump and Zelensky.
Yeah. Carl, you've mentioned before coming on live, you mentioned that the truth is getting to the surface in terms of the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. With the ceasefire between Israel and Palestine, we have the first phase is just been concluded, but it seems that Israel wants to extend the first phase of the ceasefire. But Hamas is talking about the second phase. How is that going to play out for the situation in the Middle East? And the other thing that it seems that there are tensions between Israel and Egypt that are escalating, that I don't know to what extent Israel is prepared to go after a new front. They were talking about 7 front fighting, and right now they're opening a new front with Egypt. How do you find the situation right now?
Well, first of all, that was expected because remember what happened in South Lebanon? The agreement was made in the end of November. They had 60 days to comply, and eventually they did anything, and then they asked for an extension of the conflict of the ceasefire. So that was expected with Israeli. They never, underlined twice, never complied with the agreement they have signed. Never. And that's the reason why when you see the detail of the agreement that was passed between Hamas and Israel, you have, for instance, the release of prisoners is not just during the first phase, but it's also into the second and the third phase. And that was the idea of linking those phases together in order to limit the options for Israel to escape the process. And because only the first phase was negotiated in detail, the phase 2 and 3 were to be negotiated during phase 1, and therefore the Hamas or Palestinians, I would say, because it's not simply the Hamas, the Palestinians have perfectly understood that Israel would not comply, and they will try to extend, and they will try to drag the first phase as long as possible in order to never go into the phase 2 and phase 3, which are basically phase 2 is where you have all the forces of Israel withdrawing out of Gaza, and the phase 3 is in essence the reconstruction of Gaza. And that's obviously something Israel doesn't want to do. And therefore, it was expected that they would not comply. So now the Israelis are using the humanitarian aid as they're taking humanitarian aid as a hostage, in fact, or Gazawi population as hostage. You can take it both ways, because they prevented humanitarian convoys to enter Gaza. So this is the way of the Israelis to escape the reality of the agreements they have signed. Now, the problem is that, and that's in fact what the 7th of October and what happened after has revealed, is the real nature of Israel. And that, I think, is something Israel has totally underestimated. Of course, it has some support, and it will probably have the support of the Americans, the Trump administration. But again, there might be a point where pragmatism would come to the surface. And as we have discussed with the Ukrainian conflict, the Trump administration is extremely pragmatic. They have one objective, and they want to focus on that primary objective, which is making America great again, period. It's not making Palestine or Israel great again, it's making America great again. Meaning that Trump is certainly in favor of Israel and probably has not much doesn't appreciate the Palestinians. But on the other hand, he wants to have, as in Ukraine, he's not a pacifist, but he would like to have these conflicts behind him. These are conflicts that were managed or poorly managed by the Biden administration, and for him, these are Biden's conflict. He doesn't want to have this conflict to prevent him of doing his main objective. So it might be a point where Trump will have to take the advice of the Arab states, because what the Arab states have noticed, even those who were, let's say, neutral or even probably favorable to Israel because of the relationship with the US. I think that's the main reason. But in any case, like Saudi Arabia, for instance, they were ready to have an agreement with Israel. But today, it's not exactly what they expect. They have seen that Israel is not a good faith partner, and therefore they put a condition for having an agreement with Israel, which is the solution for the Palestinian state. And everything we have seen in the last year or so shows that Israel is not complying with international law. So we request always from the Arab state that they comply with international law, but Israel doesn't. And that creates an animosity or even acrimony against Israel, which goes mounting. The insistence of Israel having the Gazian population deported to Jordan or to Egypt has created problem in those countries, and the Egyptian, who obviously have not been very committed for the Palestinians in the last conflict, today they start to realize that there is a global move towards the Palestinians and against Israel. So there is a mounting pressure on Israel to comply with the agreement they have signed. I don't know how Israel would, or if Israel will change his mind. In essence, Israel has never changed its mind. They have only changed it in surface, but never in depth. And as I think I have said, that even if they comply with the agreement, they will find a reason to reverse the situation. So even if we have an agreement today, even if everything happens and unfolds as planned, phase two, phase three, I think they will find a way to come back and to redestroy everything that has been rebuilt. So unless the international community imposes severe sanctions on Israel, I don't think that Israel will comply with the international law and even with the agreement it signed. So that's my personal view. I think we can discuss that for hours, but we come always to the same point. As long as Israel doesn't understand international law as other countries do, the history will repeat itself permanently. And that's the history. The problem is to know how far Arab states will go along with that, because there will be a point where they will run out of patience. And we see that the current situation is that we have a declaration from several countries, including UAE's, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, even showing that they are running out of patience. And we may have, I don't expect that very soon, but we may have a coalition that decides, now let's solve the problem.
Yeah. Kamal, thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much.